Alrighty, welcome to the Roundtable for Business Summit. And I want to thank all of the speakers here participating on this. In order, David Sheff from Capital One, and Dan Banga from Amazon AWS, SageMaker, and Michelle Ufford from Netflix, and Pramod Desai from Oracle/datascience.com, Dave Stewart from DoD, and Michael Lee from the Data Incubator. Wonderful. So what we wanted to do is put together a panel of people in different areas of enterprise involved very much with Jupyter, particularly Jupyter infrastructure at scale. And we wanted to discuss some of the issues that have been coming up about enterprise, what we've seen in terms of compliance, privacy, ethics, but also other issues that have come up during the topic of the course here. And we have a few questions made. I'm happy to field questions from the audience also, but I'd like to moderate those. Since we have folks from different companies here, I really didn't want to have this be pointed at any particular company or any particular individual. We want to talk about what are issues that are common across enterprise. All right, does anybody have a burning issue you want me to throw out a question, or shall I? Actually, what would be good first, though, is how about if we just go down the line and everybody just give like a one-liner or a brief intro of who you are and what your interests are.
Cool. So Michael Lee, CEO and founder of the Data Incubator. We help companies train and hire data science talent. And in that kind of training process, thank you. And in that kind of training process, both for the fellowship that we run with for PhDs exiting academia, entering industry, and for the corporate training that we do, we rely heavily on Jupyter. We were an early adopter back in 2014 when it was still called IPython notebooks. And now we're trying to push the envelope with running kind of large MOOCs for the developing world and doing that all on Jupyter Hub.
I'm Dave Stewart, so I work for the Department of Defense and inside the U.S. intelligence community, and I've led an effort for the last 3 years to get Jupyter used by enterprise analysts within the IC to really empower them to apply code to their tradecraft, making that tradecraft more efficient, more repeatable, and more shareable. And so a lot of the challenges, the scale of our organization, a lot of collaboration challenges, as well as some of the sensitivity of our data and the challenges and how do we collaborate, with different levels of roles and accesses, and given the classified nature of a lot of our work. So, I'm looking forward to all the questions, but we'll get into that more later.
Hi guys, I'm Pramod. I used to work for startup datascience.com, but I say used to because we recently got acquired by Oracle. So myself, I work on different aspects of machine learning. We've been using Jupyter a lot, and of late I've been exploring better ways of model explanation, evaluation, that kind of stuff. So happy to field any questions if you guys have anything specific to machine learning evaluation or Jupyter environment in general.
Hi guys, my name is Michelle. I lead the big data tools team at Netflix, which is a team of software engineers focused on usability improvements and innovation for the Netflix data platform.
Hi guys, I'm Dan Banga. I work for AWS and I focus on machine learning platforms at AWS. Essentially what that means is that I work with our customers to understand what are their needs as far as platforms are concerned. And what my engineering team and my team does is to accelerate the process of essentially building on top of the AWS technologies. So what that means is that we provide Jupyter as a platform, and we provide model training and model hosting as platforms, as well as algorithms as a platform.
Hi, my name is David Sheff, and I lead the financial services data product engineering team in our financial services division at Capital One. And primarily we focus on creating platforms for analysts and data scientists to be able to consume our data and use our data in the most effective way possible. And that includes both things like Jupyter and other notebook products, as well as things like reporting-based platforms for users to be able to do reporting as well.
Alrighty, I'm going to start out with one of the questions that we had circulated earlier. And also going along with the title of the roundtable, with GDPR recently coming into effect and with similar kinds of legislation now in California, CA privacy probably somewhat of a trend picking up in the US. Are you seeing examples, or can you point to examples of data being more intentional in the enterprise as far as data collection, or is it more a matter of drawing back from collecting data that's unnecessary? Is there any kind of a distinction there? Is it reactive or is it proactive, I guess is probably the question. Any takers on that?
So I think it's important and for any enterprise to really take a look at their data sharing policies and the way that they govern their data, and really to think about how you can manage things in an unassailable way. And what I mean by unassailable is, there's things that are going to come down the pipeline, and there's things that you can see in the marketplace that are happening. For example, just with what happened recently with Facebook and the California law that Paco mentioned. And the reality is that we have to prepare and be open to the idea that these type of changes are going to come down the pipeline. So the best thing to really do is just to make sure that as an organization, you really focus on having these practices in place from the get-go. And that way, as these kind of policies come down and actually get implemented, then you're in a position where you can very easily transition and absorb whatever those changes might be.
Yeah, what I may add to that is policy really brings in the requirement or the need to start digging deeper into, where's the data, who owns the data, and then who has access to the data, right? So data cataloging becomes more and more critical within the enterprise, and the tooling around data cataloging also becomes more and more critical. And so that's another aspect of looking at that, right? Where I think for machine learning to be successful, there's this whole concept of having to share data, which is very important. But at the same time, you want to be able to share the data with the principals within the company that can have access to that data. So I don't see a pullback from an enterprise standpoint. I see more control as to who has access to the data and then using the tools to make sure you ensure that.
Is Jupyter used as part of the tooling for that kind of accountability, the data cataloging?
Yeah, absolutely. So Jupyter is used to essentially templatize the access to those data sets, for example, that could be on the cloud storage, and then use the data, the policies on the data set itself in order to limit access to that data, yes or no. So what that means is that you could have a Jupyter template that says, well, the data is in this location, and then you would use it, but it would fail for you, for example, if you don't have the explicit access to that piece of data set.
I can't speak to the privacy aspect specifically, but what I can tell you is that we take privacy very seriously, and we've taken a systemic approach because we know that this is an area that's constantly evolving, and we know we're going to see more changes here. So we've developed what we call a paved path, so that anybody who's on the system using the set of tools that we provide, we're going to take care of those privacy changes whenever possible for them. And we have a multi-pronged approach to detecting any sort of like private data that gets into the system inadvertently and gets automatically removed. So.
Cool. So, so my perspective on privacy in GDPR so far has been that in the space when we have to build models, I feel that it's both reactive and proactive. From the very beginning of data collection, the sources are so heterogeneous these days. And there could be so many bias that could be introduced even as we are collecting the data. So that point itself, it becomes very important that we involve the stakeholders very early on, even as we are collecting the data, so that we could make corrections as we need it. Now, the reactive part is when we're building these models. Again, at that point in time, what features are actually considered, what are not considered, why we are considering it, these questions becomes very important. And having an environment which is very interactive like Jupyter helps in this collaboration, which could be very heterogeneous. People coming from different environment, different backgrounds. Some could be engineers, linguistics, psychologists, business folks. And having like a common platform so that we could all speak the same language becomes very important in solving such data governance and policy issues.
So I'll just add, like, from our perspective, right, we're coming at from the different side of it, where being in government, Julie kind of mentioned in her talk, like, you're only authorized to do what your governing authorities and law and kind of policy gives you for your data. So we already, everything we do needs to be kind of drawn back to those authorities and that law, that policy. And so the interesting thing is, I think, from private companies, from the private sector, is this potentially brings them more in line with how government has already had to access data and some of the challenges that we already have because we've always had, regulations given our authorities. So.
It strikes me also that with cloud practices, we're also seeing something very similar. The kind of environments that you've been operating in for a long time.
Yep.
More of those, I don't know, I should even mention zero trust, but those kind of ideas.
Of course, yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, so I'll tell you a story and just give you a bit of background about the story. So we run this application process for this free fellowship we give to PhDs. And so we get thousands of applicants, and sometimes those applicants come from Europe. So this time around, we had an applicant came through. They didn't make it. It's a pretty competitive process, but they didn't make it. And then afterwards, they wrote, "Hey, I'd like to. I'm invoking my right to be forgotten, and I'd like to have my records deleted from the database." And so that then sort of brings up a whole bunch of issues, right? Like one, there's, okay, you have their record, but usually in the way you lay out your database or your system, there's a record and then there's adjoining records. So you don't just delete one record, there's multiple records, and you have to kind of go chasing those down. But if you think about that some more, then there's all the log files. What happens if you logged, user XYZ with this email address logged in at this time? That becomes a thing. But that's in a log file that was probably written in a write-only architecture, or let's say write-favorable architecture, and batch read architecture. So like removing a line from that is sort of not easy, right? So there's all sorts of things that you kind of have to think about, and I think it's starting to change. That's a very small, easy to understand example in a small company, right? But if you think about now blowing that up to a large enterprise where you're operating in Europe and America and Asia, and they all have different rules about how you do this, how does that affect the way you architect your data, and how does that affect the way you do logging or any of these issues? It only makes it more complex.
I didn't hear the original question, so just go ahead.
Okay, so the original question was in light of recent GDPR, and along with that in the U.S. now with CA privacy and perhaps this trend picking up in the U.S., are you seeing examples of where it's either more proactive or more reactive in response to the legislation? Are we shutting down the data, or are we actually being more intentional?
So I'm an economist, so I'm going to say two different things, and neither of them are going to be right, right? So bear with me.
And they'll contradict each other.
Well, yeah. So on the one hand, as Truman said, I think it's a very good thing that people are paying attention to privacy, and I think it's an important conversation that one has to have. And I'm glad that the Europeans have initiated that, much more than has happened in the United States. Having said that, I think the focus is completely wrong. And I think it is impossible. So my colleague and co-author, Helen Nissenbaum, we did this book on big data privacy and the public good. The twin pillars upon which this whole privacy conversation is addressed is informed consent and anonymization. And neither of those are possible. It's gone. You can't anonymize data. You could de-identify, but you can't anonymize. And informed consent is a meaningless construct. How many of you in the room use Google Maps? How many of you read the thing that's allowed you to read Google Maps? One person. You have a wasted life, sir.
There was no reward for that.
Yeah, indeed. And he went ahead and used it anyway, right? But even if you did read it, there is no way that they can tell you how it's going to be used, and there's no way they can tell you what the impact is, because they don't know. And Facebook doesn't know. If my kids put a picture up on Facebook and they're drinking and they've approved it, what about all the other kids who are in the background drinking beer and doing God knows what else? So I think the focus has to be not on informed consent, which makes people feel good, but is a silly, outdated concept. And it needs to go much more towards ethical use. Trying to build informed consent and promises unenforceable and unreasonable discussions of anonymization or that you're going to be pulled out of a data set. It's just not feasible. So we need to have ethical use.
Well, I have questions, but does anybody in the audience have questions?
Picking up on this thread that you were, especially
Oh.
the two of you were picking up, especially on the last two speakers' thread, and I wonder what your thoughts are across your domains on this notion of the right to be forgotten. It's sort of, please pull the BlackBerry back out of the smoothie, right? How does that work, and because data is rarely these days the data you want in. The real meaning of data in industrial pipelines is the models that ingested the data and created predictions and are now implemented and instrumented and applied to new data, right? I have never seen anyone describe how you pull one data record out and reconstruct a model pipeline minus that data point. And so how do you get the blackberries out of your smoothies?
Well, yes. You can't do it, so why pretend?
To a point that Michael's bringing up, Google Docs, the architecture for Google Docs, how do you actually build that if you have right to forget? And only.
Yeah. I want every fourth letter of this Google Doc removed.
But I don't think the right to forget is that exact what you were talking about. You can build a model with my data. That's not part of right to forget. Because there's nothing in that model that identifies that you built that data with me. I think right to forget is, right, you can build that model with that data. We build that models with anonymized data all the time.
It's not anonymized.
So the Mapbox SDK has anonymized. Let's just agree to disagree on whether it's anonymized. Is that okay? Agree to disagree.
I'll agree to disagree.
Thank you.
But don't tell my husband I said that.
And as long as you don't tell my girlfriend that I said that either. I think the thing that's more concerning to me around, it's not that they built the model with it, it's that they then apply that model back to me. I don't want them, me as a personal person, I don't want them applying that model to me. I don't want them to have the data to be able to have all the parameters to apply that model to me. I don't want, that's the real issue for me, is I don't want to become an output in their system and having the data be input as an output in their system. That, like, I can't use Google right now without giving them access to all my map data. Like, you can't use an Android phone without basically telling Google or Amazon or a whole bunch of other services everything you do on their platform. And I think the bigger problem is I have no way to really opt out and still be a member of society. Correct. That's the bigger problem. There's no way for me to opt out.
Correct.
Whether I'm anonymized or not, I can't opt out.
So the question So the question is how can we ethically make use of the data? Because the data exists, they're going to get used, it's a contribution to society to use. What's the ethical? So I was on this National Academies panel on teaching data science to undergraduates. And one of the things that we recommended was there's the equivalent of a Hippocratic oath for data scientists.
Yeah, but that didn't stop all the doctors from doing all the experimentation in lots of places. I mean, that's, to me, it's almost like...
It reduces the probability.
Yeah, I almost want to say, though, that we should go back, I don't know if we can put the genie back in the bottle. In a certain sense, though, what if we, as a society, pass legislation that said you cannot use ad revenue-driven models to monetize your system? There's nothing forbidden from saying that, but we could say that, right? It's way harder to do that, though.
Yeah, and the enforcement. Yeah.
Unless anybody wants to comment on that.
I mean, so I think I'm just going to actually add to your point about sort of ethical use. I was going to agree that, if you think about one traditionally very sensitive piece of data that we've actually had a lot of regulation around, it's credit data. And it's not so much, the regulation is less so on how, what kind of data like an Axion or Experian can hoard, but it's much more about like what banks can use that data and what fields they can use on that data.
Yeah, but so that's really stupid, right? I mean, I'm sorry, but this is...
Tell she's an NYU.
Yeah. Yeah, forget about it. See my New York accent come out now. The problem with those credit scoring models is you're quite right that the regulations say that you're not allowed to include race, right? So instead of including race and then saying that is a strong predictor and then thinking about why it's a strong predictor, what they include instead are other things that are highly correlated with race, so it has exactly the same effect. Taking race out doesn't solve the problem.
So my understanding, and perhaps somebody from the financial side can comment on this. So we work with a lot of companies in the financial services, and we sort of do a lot of training with them. And what they're saying is that they're actually saying not and but and yes and. So it's yes, it's not only that we can't have race as a factor explicitly, but it's also that we have to pass an effects test. So we have to show that we're not, the obvious example is zip code, right? Because given the way we live in a sort of a highly segregated patterns, that effectively can become a proxy for race. And that is also sort of the kind of thing that you're not allowed to include, because at least what they're saying is that the regulators are sort of looking at, well, does the introduction of this variable actually kind of de facto add race in? And perhaps you've had a different experience.
Well, so that's the HMDA regulations, right? But anyway, sorry.
I'd like to actually speak. So I think to that point, and I can't speak specifically to what Capital One does on this, but I will just generally state that for a financial services industry, then that's essentially what Michael described is basically the way that things are done. It's true that there could be bad actors involved and things like that as well. So I think to Julia's point, the idea of looking things from an ethical lens and ensuring that there's a level playing field from an ethical standpoint, as difficult as that might be, you want to ensure that the organizations that are using your data are held to the same standard in terms of the way that they're actually using the data, and that's important. But typically what financial services companies do is they take a look at the data that's there, and from a credit reporting standpoint, they need to make sure that they're not just using like that race variable or that gender variable, for example, but they also have to look at things that are highly correlated with it as well. And most organizations have some type of model governance organization in place that looks at those type of things. In addition, your regulators will also come in and ask you those questions too. And they'll also hold you accountable to make sure that you're actually looking at those things. So that's not to say that things don't creep in, because they do, but at the same time, there are multiple eyes on it looking at those type of things to try to figure out whether or not the things are being done the right way or not. So.
But I mean, credit scores like the most financially, like one of the most regulated things that exists that has still modeling in the background for it. I guess in other areas we don't have those types of protections for the ethical behavior as well.
Yeah, and I think that's very true. But I would take like the financial services industry as a whole. Typically, you're going to classify your data in certain ways and have separations between things. So, for example, there's something called FCRA, which governs a lot of what you can do with data for certain types of activities. And so you have to actually cordon off your data in such a way that you ensure that things like if I want to share data between my credit card division and my retail bank division, if there are different legal entities, I cannot share that data in certain ways unless I've gotten certain types of permission in order to do that. And at the same time, if there's credit data versus it's non-public information like, or personal information, I'm sorry. If it's personal information like your name and address and your social security number and things like that, those are governed separately. And oftentimes you'll find that you don't have your credit data with the personal information, so that it is not directly identifiable. To Julia's point, that does not mean that you cannot go back and connect the dots together. It is quite possible to do that, but the goal is just to make sure that those things are not together so that an individual that's looking at it can't easily get to this is personally identified as somebody over here, and this is how their credit score looks like and what their entire profile looks like. So that's at least the goal in doing that. And that's something that, from my experience in the retail industry, is not present, for example. You know, the data is much more mixed together. It's difficult to extract the blackberry from the smoothie, and so those are not protections that are necessarily in other areas. It kind of depends on what industry you're in. So.
Great, thank you. I wanted to pick up on something. There was a comment earlier about oaths and Hippocratic oath being applied to, say, data science. But there are other comments throughout the day. I know that some organizations are moving toward much more self-serve analytics and empowering the domain experts for, like, citizen data science we've been talking about. But yet there's also efforts afoot for some companies to certify, actually at the corporate level, coming down and certifying who are the data scientists. Is there a tension there? Will those two things work together?
Certification and?
Well, can a company certify who is a data scientist or not at the same time as making self-service analytics and citizen data science? Is that practical in the enterprise?
You want
Yeah, you go ahead.
So yeah, there's a tension. So yeah, so again, in the Department of Defense, and yeah, the intelligence community, yeah, we have this tension, absolutely, right? So my talk was on citizen data science, so I can give one perspective and the one side of this talk, right? But so yeah, we have both those efforts, right? We have efforts to certify data scientists. It can mean in some cases like incentive pay, so it actually could mean something tangible to that employee to be certified as a data scientist. And then we have this big effort, and so instead of self-serving, we call it DIY analytics, right? So do-it-yourself analytics, and there is a tension, right? There's been a tension, for 2 years now in this community internally about how to do this. And since I'm on the citizen data science side, I can talk about my kind of frustrations with that tension. But I think sometimes these conversations that we've had internally, right, and this getting this tension takes away from the larger point of what it is we're here to do, right? We're not here to do data science just for the sake of doing data science. It's not an end to itself. We are here to providing value to the mission, and so where we can demonstrate, and I think our effort has helped demonstrate that there is enormous value in taking people who have domain knowledge and teaching them just a little bit of code to do. It may be workflow automation. It may not be classical data science, machine learning or statistical modeling or anything, but it's providing value. Then that is, like what I think should carry the weight. And then we need, and we haven't figured it out, so we haven't tried to find out, at what point does a citizen data scientist turn into a real data scientist that could qualify for a different work role, potentially different pay. So that all needs to be kind of addressed. But yeah, when we first started out with this effort, we got some pushback from the data science community internally. And again, from my perspective, on one side of the debate, I just think it misses the larger point of, is there value in that? And I think enormously there's value in it. And where my observation is there is as much, if not more, value in taking someone with domain knowledge and teaching them a little bit of code as there is in taking a data scientist and teaching them the domain knowledge, because they're equally complex tasks, they're equally complex disciplines. And in our case, the domain is so kind of unique that these people who have trained for years and have done all this work to be domain knowledge experts can make that move up the ladder in the other direction.
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to echo that. So we do a lot of these kind of certified corporate trainings, if you will. So we come into a large organization, and lo and behold, they are used to using SAS or Oracle or some sort of more legacy tool, and the executives sort of like, we've seen the writing on the wall. We need to move on to the cloud, or they usually don't say like open source or Jupyter or anything like that. They just say the cloud, and we just kind of interpret that to mean okay, we'll give you some Jupyter and some Python, and then one of the big obstacles they have is, hey, look, we hand people like AWS instances and they just look at us, stare at us like, we have 4 horns on our head. So a lot of what we do is sort of come in and provide that enablement. And I think what we've seen is that that kind of certification where the organization says, hey, we're going to work with Data Incubator, and Data Incubator does this training, and then we'll certify you as a, data scientist within our company, that can have a motivating effect. And it's often actually, that kind of training is often targeted towards actually citizen data scientists, people who've kind of wanted to be able to do this and have that internal motivation. And this is it's like a it's a way of sort of rewarding them. It's a way of making them much more productive, and then makes them sort of an evangelist for Jupyter and Python and all these open source tools. I think where the certification sometimes kind of can rub people the wrong way is, one, if you're sort of like, well, you can't touch this data set unless you're certified, right? I think that's, I mean, obviously there could be some sensitivity issues around that, but it's usually not a sort of a skills-based sensitivity as much as it is kind of, you know, for national security reasons or whatever. But then I think what we've seen is that the other half of that is sometimes people who are, let's say, legacy analysts, if you will. I like to call them like proto-data scientists or kind of data analysts 1.0. They are sort of saying like, look, I do a little bit of math. I write some code. That guy also does a little bit of math and writes some code. Why is he getting paid so much more than I am? And I think there's kind of almost an education that has to happen where you explain why the modern tooling is more powerful than what people were used to. I remember being in a training and somebody sort of saying like, this is incredibly frustrating. How does this fit within SQL? And our point being like, look, this doesn't fit within SQL. That's the point. It's more powerful than the tools that you're used to be doing. And that's sort of like, you know, when people get that, I think they often want to move ahead.
I can add. So just to add to Michael's point, I would address it in a slightly different way. I would go back to demand and supply, right? So earlier we had data analytics, which used to be a lot of business folks doing a lot of business insights, using a lot of SQL, using a lot of Excel. Suddenly what happened? Data exploded. We had machine learning, statistical modeling, theoretical ideas being done in research community. When the data exploded, people wanted to apply it to different use cases. We didn't think of doing personalized search result till Google actually started doing it, or Yahoo started doing personalized finance reports and such. So what happened is the application started changing, and there was a gap where things could not fit into Excel, and the BI insights that were getting generated were short-scoped. And so then figured out, oh, we have to go back to academia back again. And so the research, we started taking help from the research community. And then the whole idea of machine learning researcher came along, data engineers came along, and then the idea of data scientist kind of brought up, which is a combination, if you ask me, a lot of the times. So two things. What is machine learning or AI a lot of the times? To me, from my perspective, is a lot of times automating the automator, right? So we have had, a good example of this is car manufacturing companies. We have robots who have been assembling automated production pipelines for so many years. So that's a pipeline that is standardized, and we know we can automate it. So it's a defined use case. But a lot of the other places, it's not defined. It's very hacky. One has to handle distributed systems. One has to handle maybe Python. One has to handle R, Julia, and I don't know, SAS kernels and whatnot. And certainly it's like multiple combination of so many skills. So a lot of the time, data scientists are just hackers trying to put together different things, integrating and make something work. And that I think kind of has created a little bit of tension with respect to the data analyst or the data citizens, if we want to call them. And the folks, what was the other thing that we were saying? Citizen data scientist, and to certify data science, and to certify people who are doing data science. And so that has created a tension. And from my perspective, I think the world is so big, there is existence of both of them. Business insights is very valuable, which a lot of the times I have felt from my perspective working with different researchers. A lot of times researchers lose the perspective of what exactly the business insight that needs to be considered. And BI folks may have the thing that they may not handle so many data using different languages together. So maybe there could be a UI component that they could be more flexible in using that could handle this big data. And then toolings like AutoML and this kind of stuff, which is, again, helping solve redundant use cases where the BI analyst giving them a lot more power to solve their use cases in a way that they could define better. And obviously, there's a lot more use cases which has not been explored, and heterogeneous data where more people who are like data scientists or ML researchers can actually handle it much better. So in my opinion, I think there is tension, but I think the world is so big that both can exist in a very cohesive way.
Cool. Yeah. So I'll be succinct. I think that it really, what matters here, it's the output. It's where we want to get, right? It's this concept of inputs and outputs. We can inject whatever we want to inject in the system. We can have discussions around tension, who is certified, who is not certified, but where are we trying to go? We're trying to get to a position where we can leverage the benefit of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and accelerate the process of inventing and creating and getting all of these things done. And to get that done, things that have worked in the past is opening access to knowledge, right? When access to knowledge was limited to a few people, well, it was limiting the innovation process as well. That happened with GitHub, that happened with the open source movement. And what I believe is happening now with citizen data science is the open access to machine learning capabilities. So who cares if there's tension? We want people to have access to knowledge, to be able to build things, because the more you share, the more people can innovate. And that's a fundamental approach we have at Amazon. For the past many years, I mean, I joined Amazon 5 years ago, and we had a discussion, Paco. I ran the big data engineering support team before, and at the time, I have a feeling that it's almost the same conversation that was happening 5 to 6 years ago about Hadoop and big data, where the new roles like Hadoop engineers were coming up, and then that was bringing in a financial incentive, and there was tension. But look at what happened now. It's standardized a little bit. It has plateaued, and now people get to different levels of certifications and specialization, and no one worries about who gets access to the knowledge or not, right? I feel like that's what needs to happen with machine learning, and that's what we've been investing heavily into. So we run this machine learning university inside Amazon. We've been doing that for years, where anyone with approval of their manager can just come and get access to all the knowledge that is required. And what we do at Amazon SageMaker is that we go to these internal teams and we say, well, what are the cool things that you've built in the past, and how can we bring that out into the hands of a lot of other people, including some of the advanced algorithms that we actually use for our own purposes. And we package that and bring that out so that people can actually use that and innovate. And what we've realized is that your advantage of having, built your business on top of a specific algorithm like deep autoregressive, forecasting, is not going away because you share that algorithm. You can still innovate while other people innovate and potentially generate something that you can learn from. So we're all in for, I'm not going to use the word democratization because everyone is using that, but we all in for, opening access to knowledge and creating new roles and, incentivizing people into learning the skills and certifying them. That's okay. Certification is up to the certifier, right? So I think it motivates people to actually get, on the train.
So I love the term DIY analytics, because I think that is the best way to describe this, right? You can have somebody do a DIY home remodel, and that person could spend a lot of time and research and deliver a great remodel. And then you could have somebody who just kind of wings it, and they have all kinds of problems. And you could have the same person who does both things in two different remodel projects, right? Same thing with all of the data science products or any of the analytics that we create. So the approach that we're taking is more of a certifying the data set or the data product rather than the person. And we are trying to measure the quality of the data set or the data product, and also surface the like the various stages that this goes through. So like, let's say that I create something and it's more for ad hoc or one-off purpose, or maybe I just need to share it with my team. That data set can become discovered by other people. And that's not a problem until it's a problem, right? And that point, like what I really need to do is not limit people from being able to create those data sets. I don't want to limit them from being able to discover it, but I need to let the data owner know that somebody outside their team is starting to consume that, so that they realize at this point they become a dependency for somebody else, or the point at which it becomes a production dependency, even more so. We need to now apply higher levels of rigor and quality, right? So rather than, I would say, like certifying the individual, it's more of like certifying what it is that you're doing, and does this meet the overall quality standards that we have for this?
More of like putting it into operations terms, more of like a progressive rollout. For CI and CD, if only 1% of the customer base is using it, you don't put as much on as
Exactly. If we tried to put those restrictions in place, then we're going to slow down everybody that has these ad hoc needs, right? We don't want to do that. We want to do things that make sense. And there's a point in the life cycle of a data product at which we care about these things, and there's a point at which we don't.
Okay, any questions? Any questions from the audience on that? Yes.
Yeah, I really enjoyed what you all noted on ethics and concerns when you're going through the model process, but I think there's also an issue that you're not aware of your own bias until someone else points it out or until it becomes a real problem. So I was wondering if there's, and I heard a few already, if there's anything that you haven't mentioned, like tools or questions you ask yourself while you're building your models or working with your team so you can become more aware of your biases in the process or try to work out what those biases are and eliminate them.
I can start. It's a great question, a follow-up question on what Michelle was saying, that instead of certifying a person, we certify the process. With respect to the introduction of the bias, like I was saying that a lot of times we as humans, so how is this data getting collected? As somebody was saying with respect to Google Maps, so the way we travel, the way we do our transactions, we as humans, depending on our taste and ideas and what we prefer, we make certain decisions. We like an ad, we don't like an ad, and each of this is actually being used to build another model. So bias could be introduced during the data collection process as well. Now, when we work, especially in an enterprise setup, when we have thousands and thousands of individuals, it's very difficult to keep track of each and every feature that is actually being used and whatnot. But before the model is actually built, one could ask a question to make sure that me as the person who is building this model, am I being biased to a particular, use race as an example. Am I considering or having a feature which is totally correlated with race that I'm considering into the feature? That might help in moving the profit quite a lot, but I don't know if it's an ethical model that we have. And a lot of these problems are coming up, right? So sometime back on Twitter, there was a discussion on YouTube as to how they consider sorts of data that may not be ethically standard, but then again, they have to move the business ROI as well. So I think we kind of, for me personally, it's a very difficult question to answer and what exactly should we ask ourselves? And the reason is this. Whatever we do, whether it's a certified, whether it's a citizen data scientist or not, a lot of times this metrics has to drive an ROI. If the dollar or the profit is not increasing, people start asking questions about the initiatives as to why this thing or money is being spent. And so at that point in time, this thin line between making sure that the business is driving profit and how the data is coming in, it kind of becomes very troublesome because a lot of the times the data is never of the quality that would actually help in driving the business problem. And we start thinking in terms of like what kind of feature do I consider to maximize the profit? Like we were talking about zip code earlier. Zip code could be a good indication as to which house is going to be most expensive in the next couple of years, depending on the population that is shifting there. Now, these are some hard facts which are there, and if one has to make sure that the model is doing good in predicting the house price, I mean, I don't know right now at this point in time if I'm the person who's building the model and the stake is on me. I don't know what features else to consider if zip code is the only one which is closely associated to the feature, to the ROI. And so it becomes a very conflicting problem. What I've thought right now is that maybe at least we could raise our hands and inform the organization that this is what it is, and then adhere to the process that has been established, or bring up questions how we can certify some process associated with it.
I think there's a couple of things that you can consider, and I think it depends on what kind of organization you're part of and the situation that you're in. But I think the most important thing is simply transparency on what you're doing. If you're transparent on what you're doing, if you're part of an organization that you cannot share publicly what you're doing, then within the organization, at least, you can be transparent in most cases, not in all cases, but in most cases. You can be transparent and put it out there for an opportunity to get feedback on, just like you would for a product or something like that. Oftentimes, we have products internally or products externally where we get customer feedback on how that product works. Treat your model as a product in itself. Ask for feedback on what things you might need to think about that you didn't think about before, or what about including these variables? Does this make sense, or is this a problem? The other thing that I would add, and I apologize, I cannot remember exactly the title of the book, but I believe the book is Unconscious Bias, if I'm not mistaken, which I think is an excellent book to really help you think about ways that you may be approaching problems incorrectly, or how you might be actually have bias there and you just don't even realize that it's there. Because as human beings, we get used to certain things and we don't actually realize that maybe we're thinking about something a certain way, and that's actually bias in and of itself. So those are really the two things that I would consider.
Yeah, sorry. I'll quickly add that agreeing with him, and I think the whole point of the question and the discussion is really, in my opinion, the most important thing. I'm a big believer in interdisciplinary, teams and practices. So just having the machine learning practitioner augmenting the team with a type of people that can bring a second perspective, and that could be customers, that could be colleagues and other things. We've really seen that working well overall. Now we can design and we can talk about the specifics within the model, but really trying to make sure that you get external feedback as you collecting the data, as you're selecting the algorithms that you're going to use, as you evaluating your models for performance, and as you recollecting data after the model is out for production for reevaluation or retraining. In all of these phases, trying to have an external opinion. And the fact that we're having this discussion is already showing that we're going in the right direction.
I think we need to change the discussion here to say we know every single person is biased. It is impossible not to be biased. And we need to normalize it, normalize the discussion, and change the question of, is this model biased, to how is this model biased? Which is why I think things like reproducible research become really important, transparency become really important, and I think that that's part of what we need to be doing to solve this, but I don't think there's any easy answer.
Okay. One last question. Go ahead.
This is really a comment. Going back to Dr. Lane's point on ethics and your point on, yes, we know the models are going to be biased. We just want to know how are they biased. Don't you think, or maybe I'm just unaware of this, is there a conversation going on along the lines of ethical testing, just like we have functional testing, we have the unit testing? What if there was a consortium that put together a framework for ethical testing, and just like you certify buildings for being green buildings or LEED Platinum buildings, where as it's a voluntary thing where somebody comes in and say, yes, I want my building to be certified, and I am putting my hand up to put the framework so that my building is green certified or platinum certified. What if there was a consortium of, like, I am exposing my system to be tested for ethics, and this is an open testing framework, citizen-driven data sets that pump in data into whatever system you're building, whatever you want to get certified, and spits out an indicator like, hey, this is what we think, these are the bias points where this system is biased.
There's at least one open source framework along those lines from UChicago. I'll try and dig up the URL, but it's on GitHub, and that's the premise. I think it's a very long road to actually reach that, but at least there's work toward that, and again, a consortium approach to it.
And I think this is where Julia's point around like the Hippocratic Oath and being able to define what that ethics is, what that line is probably like the very first step before we could really look at those frameworks and have anything effective come out of them.
Yeah. Oath and testable oath.
Yes, there was and I'm forgetting the whole discussion around this. Take a look at the National Academy's report on data science for undergraduates, because they've got a whole discussion in there about the different options of it, and they're much more expert in it than I am, and I can't remember the details, but it was a really robust and thoughtful discussion by some of the experts in the field. So it's National Academy's Data Science for the Data Science for undergraduates. Yeah. Curriculum for undergraduates. And email me if you can't find it.
Real quick.
Yeah, may just add to that point that you were mentioning about some sort of a consortium. So I think that is a governing body, which I think is getting formed. There is one other problem which is that these models, they get very complex, and there is a tooling gap as well as to how do we enable to ask people this question, or all analysts or data scientists or machine learning researchers, why did this happen? Why did the model make this prediction? And there's a lot of cohesive collaboration going on in research and industry as well, how to shorten this gap and to help governing bodies define and ask these questions more.
And definitely check out a project called Skater.
Yeah, so there are like multiple things which are associated with it, right? So for example, when we typically work in any setup, I believe that there are two personas, right? One who's a model maker, like you were mentioning about unit testing, right? So if we draw an analogy to software engineering, we have developers and we have QA engineers. And developers are writing code, QA engineers are trying to hit against the code, attack it, and break it. And that has helped us in defining the software engineering paradigm. I feel that there is a similar initiative that has been started, and the scenarios or personas are model maker and model breaker. Model maker is anyone. It's a certified data scientist, it's an ML researcher, whoever it is, doesn't matter. And there's a model maker, breaker. Model breakers are business folks, government officials, any other governing bodies with respect to privacy policies and so on, who have the ability to ask the model why did this decision happen, what are the key features that are there, and depending on the organization and their need and the regulations that they have to govern to, they have the ability to enable transparency as needed. And on that aspect, we had open sourced a project called Skater with the idea as to how can we enable enable easily to ask this question why and debug the model and identify what's going on.
Thank you very much. Okay, so at this point, I should say that my overlords are pinging me, and there are drinks and appetizers and the rest of the reception, so I don't want to keep people from that. But I did want to give a very warm thanks to all participants here on the panel. Thank you very much.